The story begins with a man named Alex Rogo, a plant manager at a manufacturing facility called Unico in a fictional town called Barrington. Alex is under enormous pressure. His plant is losing money, shipments are perpetually late, and the division vice president, Bill Peach, has just shown up unannounced at the factory floor, furious about a particular overdue order for a customer named Burnside. The scene opens with a kind of controlled chaos that many people in manufacturing or operations would immediately recognize. Machines running, workers busy, but somehow nothing actually getting done on time. Alex scrambles to pull together resources to ship the Burnside order that very day. And he manages to do it, but the victory feels hollow because it came at the expense of everything else the plant was supposed to be working on. Peach makes it very clear during this visit that the plant has 3 months to show significant improvement in its performance, or it will be shut down entirely. Alex's job, the jobs of his workers, the economic life of the town, all of it hangs in the balance. Alex is not a bad manager. That is one of the most important things the book establishes early on. He is intelligent, hardworking, and genuinely cares about his people. But he has been operating for years under a set of assumptions about what it means to run a good factory. And those assumptions, it turns out, are deeply flawed. He measures his plant by cost efficiency and local productivity metrics, whether each machine and each worker is being utilized as fully as possible. The plant looks busy. The plant looks productive. And yet it is consistently failing to deliver products on time and is bleeding money. The contradiction between the appearance of productivity and the reality of poor performance is the central tension the book builds from. Into this situation steps Jonah, an old physics professor of Alex's whom he runs into by coincidence at an airport. The encounter is brief but electric. Alex mentions he is in manufacturing now, and Jonah, almost casually, begins asking him questions that cut right to the heart of what is wrong with his plant. When Alex mentions that his plant has installed robots that have achieved 66% greater productivity, Jonah asks a simple but devastating question. If that is true, why is the plant still not making money? Alex fumbles for an answer. Jonah then asks Alex whether he even knows what the goal of his company is. Alex gives the expected answer. The goal is to manufacture products efficiently, to provide jobs, to use the latest technology. Jonah dismisses each of these answers, not unkindly but firmly, and tells Alex that he is wrong. There is only one goal for a business, and it is to make money. Everything else, quality, technology, jobs, customer satisfaction, these are means to that end, not ends in themselves. Jonah then leaves for his flight, leaving Alex standing there genuinely shaken, beginning to question everything he thought he understood about his work. This conversation functions as the intellectual ignition point of the entire narrative. From this moment, Alex begins a process of questioning and re-examining the fundamental assumptions that guide not just his plant, but the entire field of manufacturing management as it was practiced at the time the book was written. The 1980s context is important here. The business world was deeply enamored with efficiency metrics, cost accounting, and local optimization. The idea that if every part of a system is running at its best, the whole system will perform at its best. Goldratt's book is essentially a sustained, story-driven argument that this entire worldview is wrong. Alex goes home that night and begins thinking about the goal more seriously. He finds himself at his kitchen table in the early morning hours, writing down his thoughts, and he arrives at a more precise articulation of the goal that Jonah was pointing toward. The goal of a manufacturing company, he concludes, is to make money now and in the future. And the way you measure whether you are achieving that goal requires 3 specific metrics. The first is throughput, which Goldratt defines very specifically as the rate at which the system generates money through sales. Notice that the definition includes the word sales. It is not the rate at which you produce things, but the rate at which you sell them. The second metric is inventory, which is all the money the system has invested in purchasing things it intends to sell. The third is operational expense, which is all the money the system spends in order to turn inventory into throughput. With these 3 measurements, Alex has a framework. Not a perfect one yet, but a framework for evaluating every decision in his plant by asking whether it increases throughput, decreases inventory, or decreases operational expense. If a decision does one of those things without hurting the others, it is probably a good decision. If it does not, it may be a bad decision regardless of how good it looks on traditional accounting metrics. The book then follows Alex as he tries to get back in touch with Jonah, who turns out to be an extremely busy and hard-to-reach consultant traveling the world. Their subsequent conversations happen in fragmented, Socratic bursts. Jonah never simply tells Alex what to do. He only asks questions and offers principles, forcing Alex to do the intellectual work himself. This is a deliberate structural choice by Goldratt, and it mirrors the way he believed good teaching and good management should work. The answers have to be discovered, not just handed over. The next major concept Jonah introduces is the idea of a dependent events combined with statistical fluctuations, and he uses these two concepts to explain why Alex's plant is always behind, always late, and always struggling, even when everyone seems to be working hard. Dependent events are events where one step in a process must be completed before the next can begin, which describes virtually every manufacturing process. Statistical fluctuations are the natural variations in how long things take. Sometimes a machine is faster, sometimes slower, sometimes a worker performs at peak, sometimes they slow down. The critical insight is what happens when you combine these two things. In a linear, dependent process, the fluctuations do not average out. They accumulate. A slowdown at any point in the chain ripples forward and creates delays at every subsequent step. But a speed up at any point does not carry backward. It just means the next step is waiting, with nothing to process. The system's performance is therefore not governed by the average performance of its parts, but by its worst performances and its slowest points. Goldratt illustrates this brilliantly through a scene that has become one of the most famous in business literature. Alex takes a group of Boy Scouts on a hiking trip, and he notices something deeply frustrating. The line of boys keeps stretching out, with a growing gap between the fastest hikers at the front and the slowest ones at the back. No matter how much he urges the faster boys to slow down or the slower ones to speed up, the line keeps fragmenting. He realizes that the speed of the entire group is limited by the slowest hiker, a chubby kid named Herbie. As long as Herbie is somewhere in the middle of the line, the gaps keep growing because the boys behind Herbie cannot pass him on the narrow trail, and the boys in front of him keep walking at their own pace. The solution Alex arrives at is to put Herbie at the front of the line. Now everyone walks at Herbie's pace, the line stays together, and the group arrives more or less intact. He also works with Herbie to lighten his backpack, distributing the weight among the faster boys, which allows Herbie to walk a little quicker. The entire group, as a result, moves faster. This parable maps directly onto factory management. Herbie is the bottleneck, the resource in the system whose capacity is equal to or less than the demand placed on it. Every system has at least one bottleneck, and the performance of the entire system is determined by the performance of that bottleneck. This is the core of what Goldratt would later formalize as the theory of constraints. If you want to improve throughput, you do not try to improve everything simultaneously. You find the bottleneck and you focus all of your energy on improving it. You also make sure that the bottleneck is never idle, never waiting for parts or materials, because an hour lost at a bottleneck is an hour lost for the entire system, and it can never be recovered. Back at the plant, Alex and his team begin the process of identifying the bottlenecks. They figure out, after some analysis, that there are two primary constraints in their system, a set of NCX, 1-0 machines, and a heat treatment department. Both of these are constantly backed up with work, constantly the source of delays. Once they identify these bottlenecks, they begin to ask the obvious but previously unasked question: what are we doing to make sure these bottlenecks are always running? The answer, it turns out, is not much. The bottleneck machines were sometimes idle because parts had not arrived yet from earlier stages of production. The heat treatment department was sometimes processing parts that were not actually needed or that were already late for other reasons. The plant had been so focused on keeping every machine and every worker busy that it had completely neglected to think about which machines and workers were actually the critical limiters of overall performance. The team begins making changes. They station a worker full-time at the bottlenecks to make sure they are never starved of work. They implement a system of tags and signals to identify which jobs on the bottleneck are most critical. They look at the bottleneck's capacity and ask whether any of its work can be offloaded. Can quality inspection happen before parts reach the bottleneck rather than after, so that the bottleneck never wastes time processing defective parts? Can some of the bottleneck's work be done on older, less efficient machines elsewhere in the plant to free up its capacity for the jobs only it can do? They also realize that they need to rethink how they release work into the plant overall. Previously, they released work as fast as possible on the theory that keeping everyone busy was the goal. Now they understand that releasing work too fast just creates piles of inventory in front of the bottleneck, which does not help the bottleneck go any faster. But it does make the plant look like a mess and makes it harder to manage priorities. So they begin releasing work at the pace the bottleneck can process it, not faster. The results are significant. Within weeks, the plant begins to show measurable improvement. Shipments start going out on time. Inventory levels drop. The mood on the floor changes. People who had been overwhelmed by the constant firefighting start to see patterns and feel some sense of control. Alex's boss, Peach, notices the improvement but remains skeptical and impatient. 3 months is still 3 months, and the improvement needs to be dramatic enough to justify keeping the plant open. Interleaved with all of this is Alex's deteriorating marriage. His wife, Julie, is profoundly unhappy. Alex has been so consumed by work, working late, canceling plans, being mentally absent even when physically present, that their marriage has reached a breaking point. Julie eventually leaves him, taking their 2 children to her parents' house. This storyline functions partly as a human grounding element, preventing the book from becoming purely a business fable, and partly as a thematic statement that the same principles of identifying constraints and optimizing systems might apply to life as a whole, not just factories. Alex's marriage is suffering from its own version of unaddressed bottlenecks and misaligned priorities. He has been pouring all of his energy into the system that seemed most urgent, the plant, while allowing the system that is most important, his family, to deteriorate from neglect. Alex and Julie's reconciliation, which happens gradually and is never entirely complete within the time frame of the book, involves Alex actually applying some of what he is learning about Socratic dialogue and collaborative problem-solving to his relationship. Rather than trying to impose solutions or argue his way through their conflicts, he begins to ask questions, to try to understand what Julie actually needs and wants, to treat their relationship as a system with its own constraints that need to be identified and addressed rather than a problem to be overwhelmed with effort. As the plant continues to improve, Alex and his team encounter the next major set of challenges. The throughput improvements are creating a new problem. The plant now has capacity that it did not have before. In particular, some of the non-bottleneck machines, which previously had seemed perpetually busy, now have idle time. This looks alarming by traditional metrics. Idle machines mean workers not being productive, which means money being wasted. But Alex and his team have learned enough by now to understand that an idle non-bottleneck is not a problem. It would only become a problem if the non-bottleneck were made the constraint by overloading it. The idle time is actually a sign that the system is working correctly. The non-bottleneck is simply waiting for the bottleneck to produce something for it to work on, and that is exactly how it should be. Jonah introduces another critical concept in their ongoing conversations, the difference between a bottleneck and a non-bottleneck in terms of how they should be managed. A bottleneck should never be idle. Every hour of capacity it has should be used for productive work. A non-bottleneck, by contrast, should sometimes be idle, because making it run at full capacity when the bottleneck cannot absorb its output only results in the production of inventory that cannot be sold, which is not throughput. It is waste. This flies in the face of conventional manufacturing wisdom, which held that idle machines and idle workers were the enemy. The insight is that the enemy is not idleness. The enemy is anything that prevents throughput from flowing through the bottleneck and out to the customer. The plant's improvement becomes dramatic enough that Alex is called in for a division-level review. Rather than simply reporting the numbers, Alex finds himself in a position where he is essentially teaching his bosses some of what he has learned. Gently, carefully, using the Socratic method he has absorbed from Jonah, he asks them questions about what the goal is, about how to measure progress toward the goal, about whether the metrics they are using are actually telling them what they need to know. The response is mixed. Some of his bosses are intrigued. Others are threatened or skeptical. The corporate world, the book suggests, is its own kind of system with its own constraints. And one of the biggest constraints in large organizations is the belief system of the people who run them. The division that Alex works within is facing broader structural problems. The entire division is underperforming, and there is talk at the corporate level of selling off parts of it or restructuring. Alex's plant has become a bright spot. But the question of whether one successful plant can save a failing division is very much open. The book ends with Alex being promoted to a divisional management role, somewhat to his surprise, and being charged with turning around the entire division using the principles he has been developing at the plant level. This ending is both a resolution and an opening, because it positions Alex at the beginning of a new and larger challenge. The final chapters of the book are actually some of the most intellectually interesting because they pull back from the operational specifics and address the question of how to think about thinking itself. Alex and his team, which includes his production manager, Lou, the controller, Bob, the plant floor manager, and Stacy, the inventory manager, sit down to try to articulate the process that led to their success so that they can teach it to others and apply it in new contexts. What they come up with is a generalized problem-solving process that Goldratt would later formalize and expand in his subsequent work. The process has several steps. You begin by identifying the constraint, the thing that limits the system's performance most severely. Then you decide how to exploit that constraint, how to get the most out of it without any additional investment. Then you subordinate everything else to that decision. You arrange all the non-constraints to support and feed the constraint, even if that means some non-constraints are not running at full capacity. Then you elevate the constraint. If exploiting it fully is not enough, you invest in increasing its capacity. And finally, when the constraint has been broken, when it is no longer the limiting factor, you go back to the beginning and find the next constraint, because there is always a next constraint. The goal is never fully achieved. It is always being approached. This 5-step process, which Goldratt called the 5 focusing steps, is the core of the theory of constraints. It is simple enough to state in a few sentences, but profound in its implications, because it challenges the whole idea of trying to improve everything simultaneously. The theory of constraints says that improving a non-constraint does not improve the system. It only improves the non-constraint. Only improving the constraint improves the system. And since most organizations are working very hard to improve many things at once, most of that work is actually wasted in the sense that it does not improve the system's overall throughput. The energy is being spent in the wrong places, guided by the wrong metrics and the wrong assumptions about how complex systems work. Goldratt also addresses, through the book's narrative, a deeper problem: the conflict between local optima and global optima. A local optimum is what looks good for one part of a system. One machine, one department, one division. A global optimum is what is good for the whole system. In most organizations, people are measured and rewarded based on local metrics: their department's efficiency, their division's cost performance, their machine's utilization rate. This creates a powerful incentive to optimize locally, even when local optimization actively damages the global performance of the system. A department that builds inventory it does not need because its machines would otherwise be idle is optimizing locally. Its numbers look good, but it is hurting the overall system by consuming cash, occupying floor space, and creating complexity. The book argues that this is not a failure of character or intelligence on the part of the people doing it. It is a failure of measurement systems, which are pushing people toward the wrong behaviors by rewarding the wrong outcomes. The human dimension of the book is never far from the surface. Goldratt and Cox clearly cared about making the ideas feel lived in and emotionally real, not just intellectually interesting. Alex is a sympathetic protagonist because he is not trying to be a hero. He is just trying to save his plant and his livelihood and find some way to also save his marriage. The workers in the plant are rendered as real people with real concerns, not as factors of production. When the plant begins to improve and there is a concern that higher throughput means fewer workers will be needed, Alex makes a commitment, somewhat against conventional business logic, that no one will lose their job as a result of the improvements. Instead, the increased capacity will be used to take on new business. This commitment matters to the story because it reflects a belief that the human dimension of a business cannot be treated as simply another variable to be optimized. There is also a persistent thread throughout the book about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between knowing facts and procedures and truly understanding the underlying principles that make those facts and procedures meaningful. Jonah represents wisdom. He almost never tells Alex what to do. He teaches him how to think. And the result is that Alex develops a genuine understanding of the principles, not just a set of rules to follow. This means he can apply the principles in new situations, as he is being asked to do at the book's conclusion, rather than simply replicating what worked in the specific circumstances of his plant. By the time you reach the final pages, the goal has covered an enormous amount of intellectual territory, and done so in a way that feels natural and propulsive rather than didactic or heavy. The business story is genuinely suspenseful. You care whether the plant survives, you care whether Alex and Julie reconcile, you care whether the larger corporate entity will do the right thing. And woven through all of that human drama is a set of ideas about systems, constraints, throughput, and measurement that were genuinely revolutionary when the book was first published in 1984 and remain deeply relevant today in manufacturing, in software development, in healthcare operations, in supply chain management, in virtually any domain where complex systems need to be understood and improved. The lasting message of the goal is that the world is full of people working extremely hard and achieving poor results. Not because they are incompetent or lazy, but because they are working within flawed mental models that lead them to optimize the wrong things. The goal of a business is to make money. The way to make money is to increase throughput, reduce inventory, and reduce operational expense. The way to do all three is to find the constraint, exploit it, subordinate everything else to it, elevate it if necessary, and then find the next one. Everything else, every technology, every management technique, every efficiency initiative should be evaluated against that framework. If it helps, pursue it. If it does not, no matter how impressive it sounds or how much it costs, it is probably a distraction